Please be advised, the following content in this episode contains graphic descriptions on assault, sexual assault, and suicide. You're listening to We Need to Talk About Bryce, Courageous Conversations with Bobby Henry and Guests, a podcast where we engage in courageous conversations using Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce's 1922 pamphlet, The Story of a National Crime, as provocation. I'm Bobby Henry, and I am the host of this podcast. I am a community member of the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory community. I am an assistant professor at Brock University and a PhD student in the Indigenous Studies PhD program at Trent University. For those unfamiliar with Dr. Peter H. Bryce, he was Chief Medical Officer of the Department of Indian Affairs from 1904 to 1921. During this time, he examined health conditions in residential schools and wrote yearly reports calling for changes to the way Indigenous children were treated. His reports were ignored. After retirement in 1921, Dr. Bryce felt compelled to speak more broadly and publicly on the issue, and in 1922 he self-published The Story of a National Crime, in which he directly petitioned King George V and Canadian Parliament to act on the matter of the health of Indigenous children and the conditions in residential schools. In 2022, as we record these episodes, it has been 100 years since the publication of this report. In this time, a lot has happened, a lot has changed, and a lot has stayed the same. This podcast is part of Defining Moments Canada's Bryce at 100 project, which aims to create educational resources to help educators bring this ongoing defining moment of engaging in truth and reconciliation, truth before reconciliation, into their classrooms. In each episode, we will listen to excerpts from the original report as recorded by Miles Morrisseau. Guests will react to what we have heard, and then I will lead an open conversation circle to discuss the context, implications, and contemporary realities connected to Bryce's report. In our fourth episode, my guests and I will be discussing Dr. Peter H. Bryce's health research with an emphasis on the value of Indigenous children. I have two guests joining today's courageous conversation. My first guest is Dr. Cindy Blackstock. Dr. Cindy Blackstock is a Canadian Gitxsan activist for child welfare and is the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada. Through her tenure as Executive Director, Dr. Cindy Blackstock led the organization's case against the federal government from 2007 to 2016. My second guest is Elder Randy Fred. Elder Randy Fred, or Uncle Randy, is from the Tseshaht First Nation in Port Alberni, British Columbia. After living in Paradise in Barclay Sound, he attended the Alberni Indian Residential School for 9 years. Later on, he was a plaintiff in the precedent-setting case Blackwater, where the United Church of Canada and the Government of Canada were sued for sexual abuse. After a lifetime of working in multimedia, he is now an elder in residence at Vancouver Island University. The quotes we will be listening to today are found on pages 5 and 6 from the Story of a National Crime pamphlet. You can access the Story of a National Crime on Defining Moments Canada's website via the link in the show's notes.
Professor Adami had, with the writer, examined the children in one of the largest schools and was fully informed as to the actual situation. He stated that it was only after the earnest solicitation of Mr. Duncan Campbell Scott that the whole matter of Dr. Bryce's report was prevented from becoming a matter of critical discussion at the annual meeting of the National Tuberculosis Association in 1910, of which he was then president. And this was only due to Mr. Scott's distinct promise that the department would take adequate action along the lines of the report. Professor Adami stated in his letter to the Deputy Minister, "It was a revelation to me to find tuberculosis prevailing in such an extent amongst these children, and as many of them were only suffering from the early incipient form of the disease, though practically everyone was affected, then undercare may be arrested. I was greatly impressed with the responsibility of the government in dealing with these children. I can assure you my only motive is a great sympathy for these children who are wards of the government and cannot be protected themselves from the ravages of this disease."
So listening to Miles's words is always, for me, brings out a lot of emotion. And looking at this particular quote, his reading of The Story of a National Crime Pamphlet draws out so many stories and so many perspectives. And as we start this conversation, and before we go into bringing forward the relevance of the report into contemporary times, I want to open the floor to each of you to start us off thinking about what is the relevance of this particular passage we listened to, and for you to share anything that stuck out to you. I'll share my own thoughts once I listen to each of you speak. So what we'll do first, go to you, Cindy, and then we'll go to you, Randy.
I think what this quote lays bare is that the government of Canada knew that the children were dying in residential schools from preventable causes. That Dr. Bryce and other colleagues, such as Dr. Adami, had solutions to save them. And the government of Canada not only chose not to save their lives, they tried to stonewall Dr. Bryce from sharing that information with other professionals and with the Canadian public, out of fear that the Canadian public and others would further bring light to Canada's choice. They were treating these children like a public relations issue and allowing them to die in favor of some other cause that the Canadian government felt was more superior. And I think this is what really sparked lawyers at the time, like Samuel Hume Blake, to wonder if Canada's behavior regarding Dr. Bryce's report and his findings brought the government of Canada into unpleasant nearness with manslaughter.
Well, for me, the quote really brings home the whole issue, that we're faced with right now, where there's so many underground examinations going on. And, I'm pretty sure that we all know that it's all going to be very sad news, when all the reports are issued. I know Port Alberni, the school I went to, which is on my reserve, they've done some underground X-ray, and they're not releasing the findings until after this coming holiday. I think it's called Family Day or something coming up, but they wanted to wait until after that to release the findings. And it really brings to mind my late uncle George Clutesy. He was hired as a maintenance man in that school, and he told me and my wife some years later that the principal had ordered him to go into the barn to clean it up. And he said that there was so much blood and flesh from a boy being whipped in there that he was certain that the boy didn't survive. But he knew nothing about where the boy ended up. And, I know, we were all wondering where this one boy disappeared. Like, he just disappeared, just no warning. He wasn't ill or anything, and just, he was gone. And it was, as kids, we had no idea what, if we had any responsibility for any kind of reporting or anything. I mean, that, wouldn't be allowed anyway in the school. Like, it was so rigid. The domination, colonization was so prevalent that, even if we knew what to do, we would be afraid to do any kind of reporting of it. But it's children, it's children dying, and it's really, 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 really sad.
And just listening to each of your words is there's so much there, right? And I say that many times over in these many episodes I've had with previous guests on the podcast. But there's a lot that we can think about. There's a lot packed even within small excerpts we listen to. And even in this quote, and a reasoning to why I chose it goes back to it's kind of in the last lines of the quote, if you're listening and you can remember that specific part, where evidence of paternalism is rampant in the whole discussion about children, right? So in this case, they can't protect themselves from the diseases. So I'm not sure if it's actually in terms of that, but it always makes me think about what role paternalism has played throughout time when it comes to children and even Indigenous people. It goes back to things as far back as the Royal Proclamation of 1763, And you see the terminology paternalism there come up and point of discussion there, where any land to be treated was through the crown, and that Indigenous people at the time were unable to, basically, they were put under the wardship of the crown. And for me, that always comes up through residential school discussions and the whole conversation of this system. And I draw that to people's attention when we look at residential schools, not just something of a moment in history, because a lot of people look at the system as the the main idea of colonialism in Canada, but I say the whole history has a larger narrative that we don't necessarily consider in terms of this discussion. And so I wanted to start us off in that piece there. And I kind of want to do another go around, just because we've heard each other speak a little bit, and welcome your input for a second round before we go into some questions I have for you both today. So we can go back to you again, Cindy, and then we'll go to Randy.
You know, what we're talking about here is how inhumanity becomes possible when you dehumanize other people. And that is really at the epicenter of colonialism. It's this idea that Indigenous peoples are savage and the Western people are civilized, and therefore you can do all kinds of inhumane things in the service of that, because you're really not, in their minds, you're not infringing on human rights. You're doing some kind of improvement project. And this we see across residential schools, but to your point too, we see it writ large in the lands, the resource questions, and other things. Dr. Bryce, I know from his family, felt that he died as a failure because he saw the humanity in these children. He knew that they should be saved and could be saved. And despite everything he was doing, the government under Duncan Campbell Scott, but also the Laurier, Prime Minister Laurier and others, refused to do it. And even when the call went out to the public, the newspapers' headlines of the day were very stark, like absolute inattention to bare necessity of life, startling death rolls revealed. The editors of the papers were gobsmacked that Canada was doing this to children. But I think one of the key lessons that held there is, even when you get the public opinion to burst through, when the headlines died, so did the children. And I think that that is also a contemporary problem. I think about murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. There's the headline, there's the report, and then the headlines go away and nothing's done to stop the crisis of murdered, missing Indigenous women and girls. I don't think we really learned, as definitely government hasn't learned, but I don't think that the public has learned. And sometimes maybe we haven't learned as much as we should from the patterns of residential schools to stop some of the ongoing human rights abuses that we're seeing in real time happening to people today.
Yeah, colonization has been very brutal. The whole, denial, I guess, well, I'll call it denial, from way back, in the 20s with the government of Canada, not even wanting to acknowledge Dr. Bryce's report. And, that kind of attitude continued through the schools, we're going to honor 5 former students of the Alberni school who reported or laid criminal charges against Arthur Henry Plint, the former dormitory supervisor there. And when John Andrews was the principal, those same 5 guys went to him and reported that Plint had been sexually abusing them. They were punished. They were brutally punished for reporting. One of them couldn't go home for the summer. He was stuck with this Plint guy over the summer holidays. And somehow the RCMP got wind of it, and they went and they took him. And they put him in a motel for a weekend. And he's just a young kid, like 12, 13 years old. He was so afraid. And they were questioning him about Plint, and he couldn't speak. He couldn't utter a word. He was just so deathly afraid of the situation. And so, I was so glad that those 5 guys, were brave enough to continue with, wanting to lay charges against him. And, there's so many brutal stories. It's just like when we were fundraising for the court case, Like the lawyer's final arguments for the vicarious liability portion was moved up to Prince Rupert because so many of the students were Gitxsan, Nisga'a, Haudenosaunee, Tsimshian, and the lawyers weren't willing to put up any cash for anybody to go up there to be supportive. So my wife and I went to Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal to raise awareness about the case and to raise money. And so we raised enough money to bring over 50 people to Prince Rupert from Vancouver, and we housed and fed quite a few people for a week up there. And, it was so uplifting to be with our people, celebrating, the fact that, the continued efforts of these 5 former students were, resulted in, this road that we're on now, the road to reconciliation. Yeah, that's why I really want to do this video, because, they really deserve to have their words heard. And plus there were some students who received nothing in compensation because they were unable to verbalize their abuse. They couldn't get the words out of their mouths when they're on the witness stand. I mean, it's a scary thing to be on a witness stand in the first place, and then to have to share these horrible, horrible experiences. It was so traumatic. And so I really want those men to have a voice, to be able to speak their mind and share their history, which they were denied in the courtroom.
And thank you so much for sharing your story. I always want to take moments after people speak their truth and tell their stories, because it takes a lot of work to get to the point where you can tell that story. And for your story to be heard, Randy, it's been a long journey for you. Yeah. And so I always take a moment to just offer those words of thank you. And you're a courageous person for telling your story and getting the truth out there. Listening to both of your responses, there's something that was kind of moving around in my head, because I always think deep into everything people tell me. It's a fun endeavor if you ever want to try it. Live in my world for a minute or two. But there's something that you said, Cindy, earlier about when the story dies, the narrative, the story, the children die. That reminds me of my own work at Brock University as part of a team lead on a project with through the First Nations Caring Family Society, the Reconciliation Barrister program that you have at your organization. And I was doing a panel discussion on decolonization at the Academy, what it means to be a scholar in the Academy who is Indigenous. And one thing that I requested was to bring the Reconciliation Barrister and have them as a panelist. And it kind of seemed atypical for a panel, but I said to them, we have to remember what this being, this life symbolizes at the university. And I said, we need to put them next to us on the panel because they represent the children. And for me, that work always is important, because when I look at the Academy and look at the structure of higher education, it's not quite tied to Bryce's work, but there's similarities in terms of his own advocacy for Indigenous children. But in my work, where I can find overlap is like Bryce, he spoke out for the children. He made sure that their narrative was being heard, that he was amplifying their stories and making the public have knowledge about this truth. And so when it comes to the Reconciliation Barrister by the name Andioho Hatete, that's what I was telling people present. When we have that bear in the space, children are listening. The children are watching, and the children are paying attention to what we do, and they're looking for our action. And so I was listening to those, and that was what came into my mind when listening to your words. And I think there's some part here too, because I want us to help us situate, I guess, Bryce's work in terms of his advocacy for children. And so from your perspectives, how do you see his work having played out historically for children in his time period, and how has it stayed the same in terms of opposition against advocacy for children, and even what has changed through what you know about the story through time?
When we walked into the courtroom in 2007 with evidence that the government of Canada was consciously underfunding child and family services and denying First Nations children access to basic services as everyone else, had known about it for at least 16 years prior to that. had known that it was separating more children than at the time of residential schools from their families, and was choosing not to act on the evidence to remedy the problems, I thought of Dr. Bryce. I wondered if I actually would have even been in that courtroom, or more importantly, that the children would have the children been separated from their families or having to fight for basic services that every other person in the country takes for granted, had he been heard. And it was interesting that we were in the courtroom. The case was filed in 2007. It'll be 17 years old, actually, on February 23rd. It's still ongoing. But that was actually 100 years exactly from Dr. Bryce's 1907 report, bringing that forward. And what Dr. Bryce has done for me, and I think with the, we're so honored and privileged to work with Claudette Commanda, who's an elder of the Algonquin Nation, which is where we are located and where we host a lot of these reconciliation events and where Dr. Bryce is buried. We work with a group of young people called the Assembly of Seven Generations, and they do historical tours, taking people around Ottawa, which is really the command and control of residential schools, but also to go over to visit the grave of Dr. Bryce and Duncan Campbell Scott and Nicholas Flood Davin, buried at Beechwood Cemetery. And what they do during these tours is they educate the people on the resistance. And Randy talked about that too, is a courageous resistance that was happening at every time. Sometimes when we think about history, think about people back then didn't know any better. Well, that's only possible because we erase these people who are actually raising the alarm at the time. We create this narrative of history that just legitimizes the wrongdoing of these people. And I think the real opportunity is to raise up these courageous people of all walks of life, including the children in the schools, especially the children in the schools, who are saying there's something very seriously wrong going on here, including and up to murder, and you need to do something about it. That's the story. And then how do we go back and deal with monuments and other things so that we really acknowledge these courageous people in our history, and we learn in contemporary times to listen to them more closely and to stand with them.
You know, I thought COVID was going to be a real opportunity for a lot of really bold changes in society, but no such luck. You know, the whole area that I'm most familiar with, you know, is the sexual abuse that took place. And, you know, in a way that was a form of murder in itself, because, you know, the majority of people that, well, not the majority, all of the people I personally knew who committed suicide had been sexually abused. And I attempted suicide a couple of times, and you know, it's just this crazy thing. Like, you carry the shame that is not yours to carry, but you do, and that, you know, it happens with men and women, you know, who have been abused, and you know, it wasn't really taken serious, you know, even when who is the Grand Chief Phil Fontaine, when he disclosed having been sexually abused in a residential school, you know, a lot of people weren't listening. A lot of people didn't want to hear it, you know, and then it just, but that stimulated a lot of discussion, and then it, I'm certain it generated some courage in some people who, you know, disclosed their own experiences, and you know, now we're seeing that it's just rampant throughout society. You know, like the sports athletes were very instrumental in bringing offenses forward, you know, with coaches and whatnot and other players. And you know, it's a situation that is very difficult to rectify. You know, it takes so much of a big social change of mind, change of heart, you know, that you know, I think you know, by us just continuing to push for justice and for, you know, opportunities to be heard, you know, I think that you know, that will go far in us being able to understand each other's histories, and to appreciate where we're all coming from, and to be able to move forward together in a good way.
Just in response to that, I guess a simple question. to both of you to think about, and I'd like to hear your thoughts as well. How do we move forward as a society? Right? There's many things we can do as a people. There'll be teachers who want to use the story in the classroom. So how do we collectively move forward from your experiences?
I just want to put a shout out to Project of Heart. So projectofheart.ca, teachers, community members, members of the public who want to learn more about residential schools and about Bryce's story in particular, they've got free curriculum on there. We also, on our website, we have a whole thing called Reconciling History, which is kind of resources about some of these characters in history and what are some of the lessons that we should be drawing from them. The other thing that we have on our website, and we share this with Project of Heart, is 7 free ways to make a difference in under 2 minutes. So what we're really showing is, like in Bryce's time, it can get overwhelming if you look at the TRC's calls to action. You think, holy smokes, there's 94 of them. These are hard problems to solve. But the good news is smart people at the community level have already thought about the solutions in so many of these. And all we need to do as members of the public is get behind those solutions and push the governments and others to make sure that they're landed. So that's what those 7 free ways are to make a difference. And as you're talking about, Stanley, we've got other kinds of tools we make available free of charge, books for children with our bear, which is named Spirit Bear. And we also really have these ambassadors that we ask people to bring into their communities to be that reminder of our accountability for children. Because the one thing that really stuck out to me about the TRC's calls to action is that the survivors, to me, this is a survivor's work plan for the country. It's the work plan for each one of us. And the top priorities are all to deal with children today. It's don't let this happen to my grandchildren. Let my grandchildren grow up in a way that they have a fair chance to grow up with their families, be healthy, be proud, and to have a good education. Those are simple things that we can all get behind, and everyone of every age and every income level can participate. And we got lots of free ways to make a difference on our website. So that's what I'd say to teachers. And we even got animated films.
And they're great, by the way. I watched a few of your films and they're amazing. That's all I will say. Anyone listening, check them out.
Yeah, thanks. And of course, we want to give a shout out to the amazing Eleniso Bomsawin, who is an Abenaki elder. And she has done over 50 documentaries about different injustices, and including things touching on residential schools. And you can watch her documentaries free of charge on the National Film Board's website.
We'll have to put together a little list of all these resources, because maybe it's already there. Road to reconciliation is it has to continue to be strengthened. The whole government structure is it's a real challenge. Even look at where they're at right now. The government of Canada, the province of BC, they're committed to giving land back, but very reluctant. And it looks like it's going to take a long time for that to happen. But, the same thing has to happen with a lot of other government services, like Department of Fisheries, like the resource management. Science is proving over and over that, what they used to call traditional ecological knowledge is, it's all relevant. And so now they're using traditional knowledge for forest fire management in BC. And so the same thing has to happen with the sea resources. The management has to be turned over, or at least 50% of it, but without having to go to court to fight for it. Like these court battles are just, it's such a huge industry, and it just seems nonstop. Like my nation in Port Alberni, I think, are involved in 20 court cases. It's absurd. The individuals, families, I think there's a lot of work that can go on with reconciliation. And like what I do is one in spirit walks, and take a dozen people out to the forest and walk, and start very basic with bring my hand drum, sing a song, say a prayer, talk about the history of the place, share my personal story, and then allow everybody to walk and get to chat. And then when we get to a place where we can stand comfortably in a circle, then I get each of them to introduce themselves and share their personal story. And nobody has ever refused to share their personal story. But it always leads to a lot of tears, a lot of emotion. And then I get them to hug each other, and just that personal contact, comfort, it's so positive. And so by the time we're sharing lunch afterwards, everybody's really happy and laughing a lot, and they're really lots of fun. I talk about First Nations values, and talk about the history of our the schools, and there's always a question, well, what can I do? So that's a big topic. But I summarize it just by saying, we got to get to know each other. Like you're in the traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw, and you have to become familiar with their values, and they're really no different than any other Indigenous values. They're love is the most important, and respect, and all these values that we have to share amongst each other and use, like every day, and just keep teaching them, making sure that we keep teaching them to our children, so that they don't have to live through all this conflict, and like it just seems like a never-ending conflict, when it comes to dealing with history of our governments. And they were colonized, heavy-handed colonizers for centuries, and it's going to take a while to get them on track, to get them on the road to reconciliation.
And I want to go a little more further off of that idea, because you talked a lot about the values of children and values that we have as Indigenous people across Canada, because each of you come from West Coast territories and communities. And in listening to your words, another question kind of surfaced in my mind, and this is to do with the fact of residential schools themselves. And I think everyone would know this fact that taking children away from their families is never a good thing to do whatsoever. That was fact for, as you both put, a couple hundreds of years here in Canada, more aggressive in the 100 years when residential schools were operating. And those listening, I guess I want to kind of ask a question on their behalf, might be, what is the value today for children to be in their communities, surrounded by families, intergenerational families? So we're not just talking immediate families and first cousins, but the larger families themselves and structures of families. That can include your grandparents, even great-grandparents. So I want to pass that question to both of you. What is the importance of children being in their families? It's a simple question, but let's go a little deep with that question.
This is a human question that most of us can understand. When we think about our own childhoods, we think about asking the adults around us, what was it like the day I was born? What was it like when you were growing up? What was it like? When did I say my first words? What are my favorite foods? What were some of the songs we used to sing, or the celebrations we had as a family? All of those things that come to your identity and make a loving life are things that you get from your family and from your community. We talk about culture, and sometimes we think it's about putting up a totem pole or having a ceremony of some sort. Those are elements of it, but culture is actually far more important. It is the way that we love one another. It's the way that we love the earth. It's the way that we relate to one another, including those who have gone before us and those who will come after us. It is an understanding of how we give generously of the gifts that we have, and help and support others in our community to give generously of the gifts that they have too. So it's all of those pieces. And when you take that away from a child, you disrupt all of that kind of learning, that identity, that the stories that they will then be able to pass down to their own children. And that disruption often creates a lot of trauma. You know, we talked earlier about residential schools, and one of the things that came before Dr. Bryce's report was an 1895 warrant requested by Duncan Campbell Scott by the Department of Justice. And this was a warrant that allowed for the removal of Indian children by Indian agents. And one of the key reasons was you could remove an Indian child so that they would be properly cared for under the non-Indigenous system. Well, Randy has talked to us what that looks like, that other alternative, that their conception of properly cared for. You know, when we remove a child from their family, we kind of make a promise that we're going to give them a better life. And we rarely ever deliver on that promise. And I think this is one of the things we have to learn, is the reality is there are some children that are in a family construct where they are in danger. But we've always had traditional systems that where families were struggling, that we could actually intervene and encircle that child with safety. That's why children in First Nations communities writ large are members of the community. Our concepts of family are much broader than one or two individuals. And then the other piece about this is that we have to look carefully at where we're moving First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children to, if they are going to be removed. Where are they going to? Is that a better life? How are we making up for all of these things that children need to grow and develop and be healthy and happy and proud human beings who are the keeper of the sacred knowledge that their ancestors passed down to them?
Well, my travels all across the country, and including the north, it's very common to hear people say, "Children are our future," and that's why it's so critical for us to be really putting a lot of energy and focus on ensuring that our children are taught, how to be good people and how to be caring and sharing. And what I've heard on Vancouver Island quite a lot is that children were every day were told that they were loved, and it was very common for children to be spending a lot of time with their grandparents, and I know with my grandparents, like, I could feel their love. They didn't even have to say anything. The work that you're doing, Cindy, is just so important for creating awareness about a real injustice in our society, and it can be corrected, and it should be. And there just seems to be so much reluctance, when people are or an institution is found to be wrong, it's just so difficult to change that mentality. But I have a lot of faith in our children. I have a lot of faith that they're learning and wanting to be good people. Society today is just creating so many challenges for people of all ages, and it's getting to a point where are there really solutions? Like, you take the homelessness issue, and I mean, there are solutions, but nobody is bold enough to make changes. With the mentality that we inherit, from people like McDonald and Scott and others. It's just like so many of their beliefs are ingrained in people, in society today, and I think that's our biggest challenge, is to be educating those people. But when you get somebody with a certain train of thought, it's a lot of times it's impossible to change their minds and change their attitudes. And, that makes it more important for us to really value our children and value their education.
And just to follow suit to that, something it just reminded me of the work I did with our reconciliation ambassador at Brock University. And when working with the local elder from our local community, the idea of names, traditional names, came up as the point of discussion, because part of our duty in accepting a reconciliation ambassador was to gift the bear a name. And for me, I had familiarity with our customs of naming in my community. We have teachings that have been passed down through me through my grandparents about what our names mean. And to put it into simple terms, our people in this physical world have names that are from this world that are given to us as children. And those names can be made of many different things. There's a whole story, there's a whole teaching around it. But one thing that I learned through talking with the clan mother who we work with is to understand what does that name mean, that process mean. When we inherit the names that are gifted to us come from what we call like the clan mother's basket. And she has those names and she's responsible for knowing all the names in the clan. And when a new life is born, she coins a new name for the child that's born if there's no name in use in the basket. Or when someone is deceased, they say she collects and takes the name and puts it back in the basket for further use again after a certain time has passed. So when our names are gifted to us, we're not just that name, we're the person who had it before us. We're also the person before that person. And you can start seeing like the amount of people who've existed who carried that same name. This is us talking about how children today have a lot of responsibilities and a lot of duties. And when we gift that name to them, it isn't just gifting a name for sake that they have a traditional name. You do have to have a name, we understand that. But there's more to it than just that. And I think this is the added piece that people may not know of when the name is taken at residential schools. When those names are removed and given more traditional Anglo-Saxon names or Christian names. And I draw that out just in response to what you both said, because this is that resurgence of these thinking. And you see this in our communities. And this is for all teachers, right? Listening, and anyone, in fact. When you see an Indigenous person having a name in their traditional language, take the time to know that name and learn to pronounce the name, because that is resurgence of that language. That's that resurgence of that ancient custom. I only speak from the Haudenosaunee perspective. It's not universal. And there's even a difference in terms of my community and my families as well, the different families that live in a community. But I wanted to share that story and to just welcome feedback, to let's continue the discussion a little more about this, because I just wanted to share a little bit about my work. And this came through when I did work with the Reconciliation and Barrister program at Brock University. So I'll do a quick go around again, and I'll have one more question that I've been dying to ask both of you.
And I'm so glad that our barrister has found such a good home at Brock. And really what they're spirit bearers relatives, but they're meant to also give people an opportunity to think more deeply about the things that you're talking about the importance of a name, not just a name that others branded you with, but one that was thought carefully about with your ancestors, with the whole process of that name. The fact that this name that you have will be a legacy to another child who you yet don't know, but to whom you owe a sacred responsibility. And it kind of makes alive too to the non-Indigenous public how many wonderful things, and Randy talked about this too, how many wonderful things First Nations and Métis and Inuit peoples have gifted to Canadians, including the name of the country. And people don't even think about this stuff. Or with the Iroquois Confederacy, the whole idea of a political caucus, or that model was used as a basis for the structure of the United Nations. The land, the resources, so many things have been gifts of Indigenous peoples to society. And part of colonialism is thinking of us as only the takers and thinking of us as only the people that need everybody else. But actually part of it is our dignity and tradition is about being proud, independent people who look out and support with their neighbors. And that's what we did when the earliest people arrived here from Europe, is try to look after them. And I think that just is one of the best demonstrations of those traditional values at work. And so there's so much to kind of enliven and feel proud of, and for Canadians to really reflect on how much they've benefited from and continue to benefit from the resurgence and the strength of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples' cultures and their languages.
I'm in the process of working on setting up an archival website. And I did a series of really short videos called Contact, No Contact. And the best story was our neighbor up the street. She talked about her German great-grandparents moving to Canada, and they ended up in Alberta, and they were living in a tent. And this tribe of First Nations people came by. They were food gathering, and they camped next to them, and they approached them and said, hi, where are you living? We're living here in this tent. Where are you going to live in the winter? In this tent. No, you're not. You're going to die. And so the First Nations brought the couple over to a nearby hill, and they helped them dig a cave, and they survived the winter. And our friend up the street said, that's why I'm here today. It's because of those First Nations people. So, the generosity of First Nations people was, it just continues today, and, I keep thinking about my wife. She shares a story about when she was little, she used to go to a house at her mom's home, and her auntie would look after children when there was an event going on. And the children were so obedient. She had such a soft voice, you could hardly hear her. But when she said anything, those children were, if she asked them to go inside, boom, they were running inside. It was just a different relationship, There wasn't any domination or, anything going on. It was just respect and love. And my mom said that, the child rearing techniques were quite different, traditionally. She said it was, certainly there were, little territorial wars and stuff, and, raiding parties and stuff. I know Tseshaht used to come down to East Coast of Vancouver Island and take slaves. But children in those days were taught to be quiet when they needed to be. When there were people looking for you and you were hiding from them, you couldn't have your baby crying. So they had techniques for, even that kind of a, situation, and how they did that, I don't know. If we were able to get back to that kind of teaching, it would be so cool.
Thank you both for sharing that. And again, I think there's so much there for us to think about. And the idea of contributions of Indigenous people to development of different nation states across the world. In fact, not even just Canada and the United States, but places like Europe. There's so much there that's comes from North America and Turtle Island. And I had a question now because we're nearing the end of our episode here. This last question is to do with the work you do, Cindy, with Peter Bryce's grave in the mailbox that's there on his grave. So tapping into your own perspectives, and we put ourselves through the minds of a child. If you had the opportunity to write a message to Dr. Bryce and put it in the mailbox on his grave, what would you each say, and tell us why?
I would, his greatest lament was that the work did not get done. And when he talks about that, he's talking about making sure that the lives of the children in the schools were saved. And so every time I go down to see him, I tell him that we're working on making sure that the work does get done. And I thank him for everything that he did to set an example about how we can all do courageous reconciliation. And that goodness, that courage to stand up and do the right thing, even when everybody else is wanting you to sit down. Sometimes you don't see the results of that in your lifetime. But over the long haul, what Dr. Bryce did is he set an echo of hope and inspiration for people like myself and people who followed. When I got to know Dr. Bryce a bit better, I realized that those children who felt that they were so alone were not alone, that there were people like Dr. Bryce who loved them enough to stand up for them. And so what we need to all do is love them enough to stand up for them. And that's what Dr. Bryce did. If we do that, the work will get done.
Yeah, I would definitely have to say a huge thank you and, reassurance that his work was valuable. And, steps are being taken, to rectify, the harms that were done, and the negative impacts of those residential schools. The work that Dr. Bryce did certainly did have an impact on all of us, and we really want to make sure that there are more and more and more and more people like him in our society, caring people.
And Randy, he was born in Mount Pleasant, Ontario, right near Six Nations of the Grand River.
I did not know that. Wow. I just wanted to say thank you both for joining this discussion today, to have this courageous conversation about Dr. Bryce's work. It's been a pleasure to have met so many people in the previous episode and to continue these conversations with you too, because there's so much here. And each time I go back to the report, I do many rereads over the document itself, and there's always new information standing out. And what you said, Cindy, about, people, he loved children enough for him to stand up, or he stood up for them because he loved the children. That struck close to me because it goes back to my grandfather's story in residential schools, when he felt alone and he felt abandoned as a child. And so for me, that kind of comes full circle to my own family history. And I want to give you each closing remarks, and before we go into closing up our episode, if you have any last words of advice for anyone listening, the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, I think we need to have a huge reconciling history tour of with Six Nations of the Grand River, where Dr. Bryce was born and grew up, right next to Mount Pleasant, Ontario. My basic message is this: is even if you're just learning about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples or residential schools, there are actions you can take right now to address the TRC's calls to action. It's easy, it's free, it's not going to take a lot of your time, and you can do that as an individual or family. So as a starting place, go on to our website, fnkaringsociety.com. Don't forget to check out the amazing work done by Phyllis Webstad and the Every Child Matters movement in BC. There are all kinds of resources for you to get ready to actually take action and be part of the movement. So don't feel awkward that you've got to wait forever until you understand everything. I'm still in the learning journey, meeting about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples across the country and colonialism. We're all in this learning thing together. The key is that you do something to make a difference and show those kids you love them enough to stand up with them.
Yep. And I totally agree with Cindy. And calls to action, I think, have to be revisited continuously, because I too, there's some that I need to really study hard to comprehend. I just want to encourage people to continue taking interest in whatever local nation's territory you're in. Take the time to get to know a little bit about the First Nations people, and in my mind, that's reconciliation. When we can really get to know and understand each other, and to really live in peace and harmony. And I keep reminiscing about the old hippie days, all the words that they used to say. The road to reconciliation is I'm sure, we won't see all the calls satisfied in our lifetime, but I think we really have to encourage people to really continue on that road. Our society really needs a new attitude, a new way of governing. We're on a good road with our children, teaching children good things through school, and and we continue to work with families, to ensure that they have a good sense of what they should be teaching their children in the way of virtues and values. And I think the work that you all are doing is so important, and I know it's helping us all to feel good about the work that we're doing. And I really thank Defining Moments for really making the Dr. Bryce report more accessible to the public. I'm certain the majority of Canadians were not aware, or even today are still not aware. So we have to keep informing the public about Dr. Bryce, and keep him really in the forefront. And his work really was so critical.
I would like to thank Dr. Cindy Blackstock and Uncle Randy for joining me in this episode of We Need to Talk About Bryce, a podcast for commemorating Dr. Bryce's health research on children in Indian residential schools. Our conversation today was a powerful testament on how everyone can participate in pushing forward and amplifying the voices of Indigenous children. If two important things stood out to me today, they are 1, we can collectively take action, and 2, Indigenous children matter. As Uncle Randy stated, children are our future. Therefore, nurturing and being kind to children ensures our collective futures are bright through our love, respect, and compassion. To imagine a prosperous future, we need to be the mirrors for our children today. Though Dr. Peter H. Bryce was silenced in speaking out against a national crime, Dr. Bryce cared, and it's his care for children that should remind us that we all shouldn't let the voices go silent. However, advocacy and taking meaningful action can be challenging. To make things less overwhelming, we are fortunate to have the TRC calls to action, as this is our work plan. Though our conversations surrounded a historical narrative, Indigenous children continue facing injustices in contemporary times. How will you act now that you know? What injustices are taking place in our backyard? Whose voices will I silence or amplify? When and where will I share what I know? These are starting points that I'd like for you to ponder and act on. Also, go further. Please add more questions and don't let the narrative go silent, for silence destroys the vitality of voices. As we wrap up this episode, I'd like to say nyawa, or thank you for joining us in this important conversation for this episode of We Need to Talk About Bryce, as we continue reading and discussing the story of a national crime pamphlet. I invite you to tune in for our next episode as we converse with Indigenous youth group organizations and advocates on how they imagine Indigenous futurity and hope. Furthermore, we will pull forward ideas in Dr. Bryce's writing by reminding ourselves of important questions I asked in a previous episode. How much has changed and how much remains the same? That is all for now. Thank you for tuning in and have a great day.